Hi everyone, good morning. Thank you for waking up this morning and coming out to listen to a talk on JavaScript. If you have used Vue before, can you raise your hand? Oh, awesome. I didn't realize there were that many fellow Vue developers here. So, as much as I love Vue, I know that it's not right for everyone. So I would like you, at least by the end of this talk, to just at least consider using Vue or trying it out, giving it a shot in your next application. And first of all, I want to thank NDC for inviting me here and arranging my travel. This has been a really great conference so far. My name is Gwen. I am from the United States, if you couldn't tell by my accent. I am a software developer and consultant there, and recently I have kind of transitioned into more of a content creator, gone the whole YouTube route, so you can find me under Faraday Academy. I also publish a lot of content for Free Code Camp, so I have a 3-hour-long Vue tutorial. So if you're really excited about Vue, you can check that out on YouTube after this as well. And you can pretty much search me, Gwen Faraday, and find me anywhere online. It's not a common name. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk briefly about some of the Vue basics, about why people use Vue.js, about the design patterns behind Vue.js, and then get into features about the exciting upcoming Vue 3.0 release. I was hoping it would be released prior to this talk, but at least we have the alpha version out, which has been out for about 3 weeks now. And then we'll go into some of the future of Vue, what's coming up, and then if you have any questions, we can talk about that at the end. So what is Vue? Vue calls itself a progressive framework. It kind of coined this term, used in this way at least. It is extremely lightweight, and you can use it all the way from being a tiny library, importing it through a CDN, until a large-scale framework. Companies like GitLab and other large companies, especially in China, are using Vue.js. It is a web framework, and it uses a virtual DOM very similar to React. So that's what it is in a nutshell, and I think to really understand the design of Vue, it's important to know a little bit about the history as well. So Vue.js was started as a side project by someone named Evan You back in 2013. He had been a developer at Google, worked heavily with Angular, and then decided he wanted a lightweight framework that would be easy for prototyping applications. So he launched Vue in 2014, actually February 3rd, so the Vueniversary is coming up soon. And then in 2016, the community, especially in China, had been booming at that time. 2.0 came out in 2016, and then this year we're going to see 3.0. And you can see that the whole ecosystem has evolved over the same time period with Vue Router, State Management, Vuex, and Vue CLI coming out with version after version over the last 3-4 years as well. So the important parts of the history are, it was created in 2014. It became popular in China first and is now spreading into the West over the last few years. It's used by the largest Chinese companies, Alibaba and Baidu, which was probably part of the huge growth of, the initial growth of Vue.js. And it started exploding in 2017. We saw a lot of growth over the last 2 years, and we're excited about the growth in 2020 as well. So in the West, some people still consider Vue to be a small framework. JavaScript is the most popular. When you look at any online survey of developers, JavaScript is by far the most popular language for professional developers. I think there's a lot of crossover because people use JavaScript and something else. but it didn't register, or Vue.js didn't register as one of the most popular frameworks until about 2018, mostly because the respondents for all these surveys are mostly from the West. So Vue.js really wasn't popularized in the West and didn't have a large user base until maybe 2018. And then you can see the State of JS survey that's come out over the last few years. In 2016, most people hadn't heard of it or hadn't used Vue.js. And that's just grown astronomically to now where less than like 0.1% of developers haven't, or JavaScript developers haven't heard of Vue.js. So why are all these people using Vue.js? The number one reason people state that they use Vue.js is the low learning curve, is that it's extremely accessible. They can use web technologies they already know. The default syntax for Vue is just using HTML with some templating and JavaScript. That's it, and you can use CSS by default. Like I said before, it's a progressive, lightweight framework. You can use as much or as little as you want of it. It stays out of your way. It's also extremely flexible, and you can use it to quickly build a prototype from just one small page that you want to use to a large-scale application. So I'm going to compare it with a little bit with other frameworks and show kind of where the influence behind Vue came from. So a lot of times when you see a comparison, it's like, oh, the stars on GitHub, or this is the weekly downloads. But you see like the top 10 most popular frameworks all have tens of thousands of stars and downloads, and what is it? The new metric everyone's comparing is the developer tool installs to see how many developers are actually using it. I think Vue had well over 1 million in the last year. So really, you could look at any of the top 10 frameworks and choose any one by these metrics. So there are a lot more important things to compare frameworks based off of. So when you look at the design decisions of a framework, there's a spectrum from a no opinion framework, which we call like a micro framework or a library, and React falls in this area where it gives you a very specific set of functions that you can use. It just handles rendering your view from the JavaScript, and then state management, routing, just about everything else you can possibly do in an application is handled by another library. So it's not opinionated at all about what you use. And on the other end, you have the batteries included frameworks, or frameworks that do a lot of stuff for you. So it's a much higher learning curve, but at the same time, you're getting a lot of extra features, and there's always that trade-off. So there's a trade-off between having a beginner-friendly API versus being able to scale, opinionated tooling versus having a broad use case for a lot of users across the framework. There's also flexibility versus speed. There's primitives, like you see in React, you get down on the low level, or there's lots of abstractions on the more batteries included frameworks, but you can also develop faster or more quickly. And then there's always the trade-off. Your users are requesting more features, but that adds more bloat. So to all of these things, Vue kind of falls in the middle. It's not as lightweight as a library, even though it's a very small package, but also it's not as opinionated. It lets you be more flexible than something like Angular or Ember. Yeah. So when you look at the influence that Vue.js, when the Vue.js syntax and design got from Angular, you can see that it borrowed the concept of directives, referencing the directive highlighted, the ngbind highlighted in red there from Angular. It also got the concept of two-way data binding. How do you keep your application state in sync with your DOM? The opinionated ecosystem. So when you look at Vue.js, there's a documented, official way to do almost everything, not almost everything, but a lot of things that you would do in an application, like state management, router. All those things are officially controlled and documented by the core team, but you're free to also use something else if you want. And then using templates, so Vue.js's templating system uses that same double mustache syntax from Angular. And then there's also the concept of dependency injection in Vue, which is also, you also have access to it in Vue 3, which is coming out. And then there was also a heavy React influence. So the timing of Vue.js's release in 2014 was after Angular and React. So Vue had a lot of the benefit to be able to see these other frameworks, see how they worked, and then be responsive to how they could create a better framework based off of that. So Vue did implement a virtual DOM, just like React. They use composable components. So basically, you break everything up into the smallest component that you can, and you import them all into each other to create an application. It mixed logic in Vue, which is something everyone said was so weird at first, but now everyone seems to love. So you can render your view from your JavaScript and mix those two elements in the same file. So you have your DOM or your view in the same file with the logic that acts upon that view. It also remained flexible. So flexibility is one of the best things to have a vibrant community, because you have a lot of contributors that are putting their time and effort into building tools and libraries that go along with that framework, because there's a lot of solutions that are needed if you have a lighter weight framework. So it kept that flexibility like React has. And then one of my favorite things that Vue inherited is from jQuery. So why is jQuery the #1 most popular library of all time by far? It's still used by a large percentage of websites. If you see, it's cached all over the place. It's because it made hard things simple. It's not because it was crazy computer sciencey or did this wild thing. It just made things simple. And if you look at the naming conventions of jQuery, it was exactly what you think it might be. If you couldn't remember, because we learned so many different libraries and tools, we can't remember the entire API of everything. But with jQuery, if you tried to think like, oh, how do I show this particular thing on a page? It would be thing.show. If you wanted to hide it, it was thing.hide. It was extremely easy to use. And for AJAX calls and DOM traversal, it became the most popular library because it was way easier than the other options available. So when you look at Vue, you'll notice that things are simply named, and they put a lot of time and energy into how they name things and how humans would respond and think about the naming of that. And it's really interesting. Maybe after this, you can listen to the Views on Vue podcast. Some of the core team members are on there, and they talk about specifically why they named things the way they did in Vue. So when I first saw Vue, my reaction was kind of, what? It's this combination of all these different frameworks. So my friend told me about it, and I looked at it, and I was like, no, this is weird. I'm going to stick with React at the time. So I ended up picking it up again, maybe like 8 months later, started to really use it, and then I thought, oh, okay. So I think because I hadn't enjoyed my time using Angular 1, so I saw directives and immediately I was kind of against using it. But then I realized that Vue was very kind of nicely designed, easy to use. And I was also I've been running a group that teaches people how to code for about 4.5 years. And teaching certain concepts, especially when I was teaching Redux and some other concepts, it was extremely hard to explain. And when I explain Vue to people, it's much easier for them to grasp because a lot of them come from an HTML background and they can use web technologies that they're used to. So in Vue's design, I'm going to talk a little bit about the design and also about the design of the ecosystem. So Vue's users are very diverse. And if you look at who Vue was designed for, it didn't come out of a company, of course. So it's really come out of the needs of the different people using it and what they're using it for, not just what a specific company used it for, and then it was kind of open sourced as an afterthought or as some kind of marketing technique. So there are a lot of beginners who get into Vue because it's very accessible. You can just import the CDN and then start using it. There's also a large number of users now, which is interesting. They're adding interactivity to legacy applications. So there's tons of jQuery and plain JavaScript all over the web. So if you want to update that, what do? Even if you add React, which is extremely lightweight, you have the default syntax JSX, and then you need Babel, and you need all these other things, which is much heavier. Vue you can just import and just use in your HTML and start transitioning. One-off projects, rapid prototyping, it's very good for that. Medium scale projects, and then large scale projects. And with Vue 3's update, I think it really focused on how can they help large scale users better organize their code. So I think it was really their kind of solidifying themselves as something not just for beginners and lightweight applications, but also for enterprise applications. So since Vue was designed for the community that uses it, I think it's important to see the demographics of people who code professionally. So when you look like the Stack Overflow survey from 2019, there were over 80,000 respondents. It's by far the largest developer survey. And you can notice that every year, and all these surveys show that developers, and especially professional coders, skew heavily young and heavily inexperienced. So if you're from a company, if you're doing hiring, and you get to choose a tech stack, then it's really important to think, who am I going to be hiring? How easy is it going to be to onboard this person with only 1 or 2 years of experience? What technologies am I going to have to teach them? Am I going to have to teach them not just a library, but 50 other tools that go along with that in an ecosystem? So it's important to think about the approachability. And when you look at Vue, like I said before, you can just import it via a CDN and start using it. So if you see, you just have a plain DOM element, you give it some kind of marker like an ID, and then you reference that ID in a Vue instance, pass it an options object, and then you can display the data inside of the double curly braces. Anything inside of there will be parsed as JavaScript, and you can just start using Vue.js and linking your state to your DOM. So Vue also has an excellent CLI. If you used React in 2015, then maybe you know of the headache that it was. I remember learning Webpack and Babel and Setup and all these different things just to build an application. And there was that meme that went around that, this person writing like complex algorithms on a grease board or a chalkboard, and it was just to make a hello world application. So it was so difficult to set up. But fortunately with Vue, all you have to do is install the CLI, and then there's 2 things you can do from there. So you can run Vue UI, which will actually bring up a GUI, or a graphical user interface, for you to bootstrap your projects. So you can add a new project, and then it takes you through a wizard. So you can choose all the options like the naming, what packages you want to install, what features are you going to add, testing and state management and routing and all that other stuff, and it'll install it for you. And you can open this up at any time when you're building your application. Just click one button. You don't even have to look through NPM. You can just add a package through here. And then there's also the command line interface with Vue Create, which takes you through basically the same wizard. So you can add all of your different features, and then it will bootstrap your whole application. The great thing is that it just works out of the box, more like Angular and Ember. Yeah. And then and so when you start from the CLI, it's going to set up, similar to React and other frameworks, it sets up basically a bootstrapped application where you have these components. And inside your components, it uses regular HTML markup to differentiate the parts of your component. So it has a style tag where you can put your CSS or Sass or whatever you want in there. And then it has a script tag where you put your JavaScript. And then I think the most interesting part is the template tag. So HTML5 actually released this template tag because it wanted people to start composing their HTML files together and not have these 5,000 line long HTML files anymore. So I don't think this was heavily used before Vue.js. I remember looking at it like 5 or 6 years ago thinking, what can we do with this? It would be great if there was a framework that used this. And so what's nice about that is it just uses the same web standards that already exist and puts them inside Vue. Also, template tags don't render to the DOM as another element. They're just there as a wrapper. Yeah, and then just like React and any other framework really, you can import components into your other components and then compose them and render them together, make a tree of components. And then, like I said before, Vue uses two-way data binding. I think it is a very intuitive system. So you have a data object in your JavaScript, and then you want to bind it to your HTML. You use a directive v model, and then your DOM stays in sync with your JavaScript, and then you can do whatever you want with that value. Yeah, and then if you want to display it in the DOM, you use the double mustache syntax and you can display that value or use it in any of your methods. Another huge part of Vue is that it focuses on reactivity. So if you look at regular JavaScript, it's not reactive, and you have to do a lot of work to make it reactive. For example, if you want to find the total of an element, so here I'm adding cat toys and cat treats, equals 24 the first time. But what if I add 2 more cat toys? So now the total should be 26, but since JavaScript is not reactive by default, the total, if you print out the total variable again, it's still 24, so it doesn't update. Fortunately, Vue handles this under the hood. So it gives you reactivity out of the box. So for example, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you can see how this prints out. And by the way, all these slides, I guess I didn't put a link there, but I'll put a link there after. All these slides, I tweeted them out, and they have JS Fiddle links at the bottom, so you can go and play around with the code. But basically, if you click on one of these 2 buttons, it will add 1 to the number in the cart, and then it will update that number. Because if you see the computed object, so anything inside the computed object, any variable that's inside one of those methods, Vue is automatically watching if that variable updates, and then it's going to rerun that method for you and recalculate the total for you. Another great thing about Vue is that the web heavily depends on animations now. So if you look at any modern website, really, things don't just appear and disappear, just like they don't in real life. So Vue actually handles animations, or it gives you a way to handle animations very easily. You can wrap anything you want to animate inside a transition component, give it the type of animation that you want, and this includes routing, subrouting, things that appear and disappear from the page like modals. And you basically say like, oh, you want to fade it in and out. It gives you 6 CSS classes to handle different parts of the transition, so you can customize it as much as you want. And then just wrap it in the tag, and it gives you the transition functionality by default. And there are many different built-in animations, and you can also use custom ones if you want. Another part of Vue's composability is how it uses slots. So slots are a way that's been developed to compose templates together. So it's not just importing, it's easy to import JavaScript functions into one another, but what if you want to reuse the same templating logic and nest different parts of the template in different areas? So with slots, as you can see the example, I can pass in, or I have the template on top in red, and this is for a page, and then I have a header section, so I can put something default in there. But you can see in blue is where I use that template, and then I can pass in, using the vslot directive, I can pass in some markup to put inside the header slot, or inside the footer slot, or if I don't mark anything as being inside a specific slot, it's just going to go into the default unlabeled slot. And I really like the term slot because naturally when you think of something named slot, you think, oh, you have to put something inside of that. So that's another example of Vue's awesome naming conventions. And so this is actually my favorite part about Vue, I think, is that it handles complex forms very nicely. So any framework can really, handle some user input and selection, checkboxes, that kind of stuff. But for forms that have a variable number of inputs, like this one that I built, so basically users can create as many sections as they want, and then as many resources or projects as they want inside of every section. So basically it's the way the data is displayed, it's an array of objects nested inside of another array of objects. And how do you handle that in terms of mapping your form state to what the user is inputting? If you've used React before, I remember the first time I tried to handle something like this, and unbelievably, I was at a consulting agency and we handled it doing something like $.something, $.something, and it was extremely inefficient. And so then we started using Redux forms, which was awesome and worked really well, but it was complicated. And Vue handles this by default. So what Vue does is you can use a simple v-for directive to loop over the form inputs, the number of form inputs that you have in your DOM. The user can add one, remove one, and it will be added or removed from the array in state. Then it's looped over in the DOM, and then you can v-model based off of either the index in an array or the key in an object, and it can just loop over those and it automatically maps it to that index or that DOMs. And it makes making CRUD operations on a variable number of form inputs very, very intuitive to use. So the exciting part, let's talk about Vue 3. And to talk about Vue 3 and what's new, the major new change in Vue 3 was a new API that came out called the Composition API. So to understand why it was needed, let's look at the API from Vue 1, Vue 2. So the Options API, and this is just a screenshot of a component that I had, was basically all these different sections. You put your data, all your data was together, all your methods were together, and everything was was organized by type. All data, all lifecycle stuff, all props, all methods together, all of your reactive or computed functions were all together. The problem with this was, even though it looks really nice when you have small components, it's so intuitive, it's really nice to get started, and that's one of the features that brings a lot of people into Vue. But then when you start to scale your components, it actually ends up looking like this. So you have your search logic and data and everything all over the place in the file. And then you have your cart stuff all over the place, and they're kind of mixed together. You have some search methods here and some cart methods, and then you have some cart data and search data together, and it's hard to navigate. So what people have been doing for the last so many years in these single page application frameworks is they'll make a new component. So you make a new component, you break up the DOM and also some of the logic you can put into the other component. The problem is it doesn't always work very well. Sometimes you want to keep that logic together, and you also shouldn't need the extra overhead of having a whole nother component just because you want to arrange your logic differently. There have been some imperfect solutions in Vue in the past, and this new functional composition API is kind of where everything came to. So the composition API is, like I said, a functional API that's a new way to organize your code by feature. It organizes all your logic. For example, the data for your store or the data for your cart will go with the logic for your cart, and the methods and the computed and the watchers and the lifecycle hooks for that one feature will all be organized together. It's intuitive because it's also how we organize our web applications now. If you have a folder of components in your front-end application, it's a folder for that feature or that part of the page. It's not all your data in one place and all your Vue in one place. It doesn't work like that. So you basically create a setup function inside the same options object that you normally use inside components. You have a new method, the setup method, and you can access low-level Vue APIs from that object, or you can import them from Vue and use them inside of that object. So here I'm just importing ref API from Vue. Basically what it does is turn this 0 in the blue there into a reactive object, which is saved in the num items variable. And then I have the add item method, which acts on the num items variable, and I return the function and the variable from the setup function. Anything I return from the setup function can be used normally in my template and in the rest of my component. So this allows me to organize my code by feature because I can put my data anywhere I want. I don't have to just have it in one data object. I can put my methods anywhere I want, not just in one methods object, etc. So you can look at those examples on JS Fiddle if you want. So of course you don't want to keep all of this inside of one component. That's why there's basically what they call a composition functions. So you can take all of these low-level APIs and import them into any JavaScript file from Vue, make a function, like here I have a use cart function and use search function. If you come from React, then you might recognize this syntax with hooks. It's kind of similar how it works here. So basically you have the use cart and use search functions, and you can use them inside your setup function. You pass any kind of reactive elements into them, or you can just use those reactive elements from the file where the function is created. And then you return the bindings from those functions, and they're explicitly named, so you know where something is coming from in your component. There's no confusion like there used to be with some former solutions like mix-ins inside of Vue. And there's no namespace conflicts unless you create it yourself. So in review of what composition is, they are composable functions that you use inside of a setup method. It gives you logical organization by feature. There's much better code reuse. So if you've used Vue in the past, you probably know you're writing the same thing in multiple components, at least when you're creating production level applications. So now you can abstract away the logic for the feature and just import it. It's easier to maintain. If you're on a team, it's easier to onboard people. And TypeScript users can rejoice because now everything has been built from the ground up in TypeScript. I know people were kind of frustrated with that. So there was kind of a quasi-working class-based syntax that people were using, which is not a part of Vue 3.0, because this compositional functional API works very well with TypeScript. It's just functions and variables, and it works. And even if you're not using TypeScript, you still get the IntelliSense, the auto-completion, all of those features of TypeScript, because Vue is now built from the ground up in TypeScript, which is awesome. And it works really well with tooling. And then there's no extra compute or component instances, which is bad for performance. And it's opt-in only. So unlike this Reddit thread that appeared a few months ago or a few weeks ago that said, oh no, everything's deprecated, you know, it's kind of like a game of telephone. And it's opt-in only. The options API is not going away. This is just a new API, and you can choose if you want to use this new API, if you want to use the old API, or if you want to use basically both APIs. Some of the cons to the new API, complexity. It's definitely a more advanced syntax, so beginners won't probably be using it. And there's lots of new API methods. This is just some of them. So part of the update in Vue was to give you access to all of these API methods, which it does, but then you have to learn all of these new API methods. And with all of these additions, with this new API, you know, it basically adds more code, more, I don't want to call it bloat, but it makes it a bigger package for Vue. So what Vue did is it says we're going to remove any unused API methods for the options API or composition API. So if you aren't using a feature in Vue, basically your bundle size is going to be smaller because it's not going to be included in your final bundle. So the final bundle, as promised last year, will be about 10 kilobytes gzipped, plus any additional features and libraries that you use, which is very awesome. And then in the Vue 3.0 update, they said you have access to all of the low-level APIs. You have custom rendering. If you have used React, you know that React Native can render to any platform. And now you have access to that inside of Vue.js. You can access the rendering functions. So if you use the components with the template by default, you can just use it. I guess you can just use the DOM and everything by default, or you can drop down to the lower level, and because it gets compiled into a render function for the virtual DOM, and you can access that now. And you can also access the reactivity system and manually say, hey, I want this element or this piece of data to be reactive, and you can set it as reactive yourself instead of just letting Vue kind of handle all the magic under the hood for you. And then there's also dependency injection. There's a new API for that in Vue 3, and much more. So yeah, those are examples of the reactivity that you can just import from Vue into your functions or components. Speed is another big upgrade in Vue 3, which is not surprising because every time a framework comes out with a new breaking version, it's always faster. They always say it's faster. So there's actually a new change detection system built into Vue. So with DOM updates, basically with the virtual DOM, it looks through the whole virtual DOM in the components that changed and figures out what changed. Well, now it's modified it to update or to not look through as much of the component because it's smarter and it knows which of the part of the component might have changed. It was basically a whole virtual DOM rewrite, more compile time optimizations. It's about 6 times faster. Now these are the metrics that the Vue team and Evan You came out with, so it'll be interesting when Vue 3 is actually released, when people test it, which parts are 6 times faster, which parts are 2 times faster, etc. And I'm not really the one to talk to about all of the low-level optimizations, but Evan You gave a great talk on all the optimizations that happened in Vue 3, and you can look at that there. And then the ecosystem for Vue. So if you look at one of the design decisions of the Vue framework that I think was wonderful is that there are a lot of tools that are managed by the core team. So they're very well documented. There's an official way to use them and to include them in your application. And they're included and configurable in the CLI because they're maintained and they have standards arranged by the core team. So one of them is state management, Vuex. There's routing, which is Vue Router. And then DevTools, Vue DevTools, which is just amazing because it puts Vuex DevTools with traversing your component, looking at component state with application events, just everything is together in one DevTools interface. There's the Vue CLI, testing, which works very well with Jest and other testing frameworks, internationalization, and then many other repos. They have like 106 repos under the core team. Some of them are examples and many of them are tools like these. So one big reason, back in 2016 or 2017, 2018, people were saying, oh, don't use Vue for anything major because there's not enough community support. And you still see that in comparisons of like React to Vue to Angular. It says that, oh, there's not as much community support in Vue.js. And that was true a few years ago. Most of the community support was in China, which is by far Vue's largest user base. But now that's no longer true. And you see that we have, Vue.js has comparable tools to all the other major frameworks. In server-side rendering, very confusingly, there's Nuxt, Next, and Nest. And because people want to, if you don't know what server-side rendering is, it's basically for optimization, SEO, and better user experience. So there's a comparable tool, Nuxt. There's Gridsome, Gatsby, and I think Scully. I've never used it, but I just looked it up for Angular, which is for which is a static site generator. If you use Gridsome and Gatsby, I've used both, and they're extremely similar. A lot of these tools are almost identical, just ported from one framework to another. Accessibility, I think it's the best in Vue. I haven't found another alternative to Vue Tensils because I don't have all of these area and all of the other accessibility optimizations memorized, so I feel like I have to look them up anytime I need to use them. But with Vue Tensils, I can just wrap a modal or whatever other component I want inside of Vue Tensils, and it gives me all of these accessibility features by default. Yeah, and then there are so many UI component libraries. You can't even count the UI component libraries that exist for every different framework. And then native mobile. So very excitingly, NativeScript Vue came out in 1.0 a year ago. And I've used it. It's basically, it's a really good tool to make native feeling mobile apps, basically. It works similarly to React Native, except NativeScript has 100% native hardware API coverage by default, which is the same if you use NativeScript JavaScript or NativeScript Angular or any of those. And then there's also Weeks, which is used by Alibaba, which is a huge company in China, but I haven't used it. So I think I would be remiss if I didn't quickly talk about the Vue documentation. It's full of code samples. It's very easy to read. It's made for humans, which not all documentation is. It has advanced use cases too. There's an excellent cookbook with examples of how you should use what. Explanations of how things work on a deeper level. Oops. It's basically what every piece of documentation kind of aspires to be in the Vue docs. So even if you're not going to use Vue, I think you should definitely check out the Vue documentation. Oh, did I? I went all the way back. Okay, so what's coming out in the future? So Vue 3.0 is coming out in the next few months. They said the end of Q1, I believe. So we already have Vue Alpha, so if you want to use an almost ready API, you can go ahead and try it out. You can also try the composition API. They made a library for you to use it in Vue 2.0 if you want to try it right now. Of course, all the core libraries are going to come out at the same time to match the new Vue 3.0 release. And the Vueniversary will be on February 3rd. So if you follow everyone on Twitter in the Vue space, then it's a big to-do. So if you want to learn more about Vue, you can check out my 3-hour tutorial where it's just basically coding for 3 hours in Vue. I'm coming out with another one as soon as they release the official version of Vue 3. If you want to know more about the design of the framework, look at Evan Yu's talks on YouTube or his blog posts. Sarah Drasner gives she's part of the Vue.js core team. She is probably the best Vue teacher and talks a lot about animations and SVGs, accessibility. If you want to see examples of how Vue.js is used in the real world, they have a great cookbook. For Vue courses, Vue School, run by the core team. And then there's also Vue's official framework comparison. So it actually gives you a big document with comparing all the different frameworks. If you want to see why Vue might be better or different than another framework, you can look at that. And it especially compares React because those are the two that are kind of pitted against each other most frequently. And then there's an excellent Vue podcast called Views on Vue, and they have so many episodes about the Vue community and tooling and everything, and they do a really good job on that podcast. So yeah. So thank you for coming, and we have about 10 minutes, so if you want to ask any questions.
Do you know what the support is like in Visual Studio Code for Vue? Or what IDE do you use?
Yeah, I use Vim and Visual Studio Code. So the support, I'd say, is very good. It's the same as any other JavaScript framework. You get syntax highlighting. They have good Vue snippets. There's tooling and stuff. I haven't used the developer tools there because I use the Vue dev tools in the browser. Yeah. All right, so thank you for coming. If you want to talk to me after, I could talk all day about Vue and JavaScript and such. So yeah, thanks for coming.